Hello everyone and welcome to New Direction is Easier 2021. This session is entitled Monolingual Perspective in Classroom-Based Testing and Assessment in the Philippines. And our presenter today is named Dan Henry Gonzalo. So Dan, he's teaching at the Department of English, Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. He was a commission on higher education scholar who completed his Master of Art degree in English language and literature teaching from the Ateneo de Manila University. His research interests including English language education, specifically on issues that concern English language testing and assessment. So now I will hand over our session to our presenter, Dan, and he can start with you guys.
Thank you very much, Huyen, for that introduction. So just let me just share my screen. Okay. Again, hello everyone. I am Dan Henry Gonzalez, and I am instructor at the Department of English at Ateneo de Manila University, Philippines. In this presentation, I argue that English education in the Philippines, focusing on assessment and testing, does not account for the multilingual and linguistically diverse context of use in the country. I argue that monolingual perspectives and approaches in ELT, English language teaching, continue to dominate the field. Issues of language variation, the existence of varieties of English, and the reality of translanguaging practices are not addressed. In other words, ELT in the Philippines persists in taking a one-size-fits-all approach that only privileges so-called native speaker norms. The implications of these monolingual perspectives on ELT in the country will be discussed. The Philippines has known diversity since time immemorial. Home to 7,641 islands, the country houses more than 180 languages and is considered as one of the most linguistically diverse nations in the world. This diversity is so strong that within a half-hour ride to another town in any parts of the Philippines, one will most likely arrive at a different language-speaking region. Despite the country being being multilingual and linguistically diverse, assessment policies and practices persist in promoting monolingual bias in native speakerism perspectives. I am using the definition of Barrett 2018 for monolingual bias as the viewpoint that takes the prototypical human as having only one language. In the Philippines, the Department of Education, or DepEd, is the executive department of the government that regulates and directs testing and assessment practices in basic education. With the implementation of curricular reforms through the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013, or the K-12 law, new testing and assessment guidelines were promulgated. DepEd Order Number 73, Series 2012, also known as Guidelines on the Assessment and Rating of Learning Outcomes under the K-12 Basic Education Curriculum, was implemented in academic year 2012-2013. Now, it offered a new grading system called K-POP. It's not the K-pop that we know. It's the knowledge, process, understanding, and performances. What is noteworthy in this new grading system is the importance it places on performance-based tasks. This is a departure from what Plata, 2017 and 2010, observed in the previous 2002 Basic Education Curriculum and revised Basic Education Curriculum, or RBEC, in 2010. In the previous systems, testing and assessment tools focus mostly on discrete point type of language testing and relied mostly on multiple choice format tests. Another inclusion in the DepEd order is the provision on the use of multiple measures. Again, this highlights the transition of the grading system from a monolithic view of assessment practices to a more diversified approach to assessment. However, Plata notes that K-pop grading system may not meet its goal of assessing the content standards because of its complicated nature of assessment and rating systems. Now, what is happening here? A second grading system referred to a policy guidelines on classroom assessment for the K-12 basic education programs was issued by DepEd on April 1, 2015. This updated system that was implemented in academic year 2015-2016 offered fewer components, namely written work, performance tasks, and quarterly assessment. Now, according to Plata 2016, this new set of guidelines has a number of shortcomings and must therefore be carefully revised because of overlaps between the three components, as well as the lack of policy guides for calibrating test scores. Since learners' grades would be mostly on performance-based tasks, Plata argues that there was a need for a common objective system for evaluating these subject type tests. Now, classroom-based assessment or assessments internal to the classroom and managed by the teacher is regarded only as an offshoot of large-scale assessment. Turner, 2012, argues that classroom-based assessment was taken for granted in the language testing literature. And the assumption was that testing types or tasks and the interpretation, use, or reporting of results executed in large-scale assessments may also be applied to classroom assessment. Now, Suforaman and Balinas, 2016, investigate classroom assessment practices of English language teachers in Indonesia and the Philippines. Their findings support the claim that language policies of an institution have a significant impact on assessment practices of teachers in the classroom. In particular, this study finds that both Philippine and Indonesian contexts use assessment for learning or the continuous way of checks and balances in the teaching and assessment processes as the main goal of assessment. Now, in a study I conducted during the implementation of the new policy guidelines of DepEd, I found that bureaucratic demands, these are the assessment policies from national and school levels, do not match the needs of language teachers and learners. Adapting Messick's value assumptions in his validity matrix and Bernstein's pedagogic device, using the study of Motteram, 2016, I examined the assessment practices of 6 English language teachers from 2 private schools in Laguna, Philippines. Data were gathered from classroom observations, a collection of testing materials, and audio tape interviews with the English language teachers. Now, the result revealed that in planning and implementing classroom-based assessment, English language teachers are confronted by these competing demands. Now, the study also uncovered that in assessment practices, the monolingual bias, which asserts that only one language permitted in the institution, and that is English, that the monolingual bias persists. In particular, both in the 2 schools that I had my study, both schools subscribe to the same language policy and test construction practices. An English-only policy is strictly implemented in both schools in the study. This is despite that the DepEd's educational policy of MTB-MLE, which requires all schools in the country in the Philippines to use the learner's mother tongues as the medium of instruction in the first few years of basic education. In my study, learners are dissuaded from code switching or languaging, or using both English and Filipino in the classroom. Aside from the presence of language policy, the English-only policy that prohibits non-English languages, both schools in the study heavily rely on a test format that does not contribute positively to teaching and learning English. The multiple choice format, or MCF, is the most common type of test used to assess the English proficiency of learners in both schools. In fact, one school purchased a databank system to ensure that all summative tests would be designed in MCF. One possible reason why these schools opt for MCF, despite national policies that encourage performance-based task assessment, is that most national board examinations, college entrance tests, and job application tests in the Philippines use the MCF as default testing format. However, Martin 2018 points out that MCF presents several weaknesses in successfully assessing the English language proficiency of the Filipino learners. First, MCF test results offer mere snippets of the possible knowledge of language structures. In other words, MCF test items do not provide the evidence needed to make informed predictions about success in English language use. Another weakness of MCF language tests is that these promote a monolingual view of language because it fails to consider that language is dynamic and diverse, consequently evolving into varieties. A number of scholars who advocate the social dimensions of language testing have also called ethical considerations in test designs, as well as a rejection of the monolingual view to testing in multilingual societies. I'm speaking of the research and articles of Spolsky, McNamara, and Ryan, and Shohami. In my study, I also found out that teachers prioritize the needs of the learners despite the bureaucratic demands on their assessment practices. The teachers in the study report about their awareness of dominant policies and practices, but rejects these when found to be in conflict with their student needs and circumstances. Rhea Dickens sees this as presenting conflicting identities in classroom assessment. That is, the misalignment between bureaucratic and pedagogic expectations in assessment. For McNamara, 2001, these instances demonstrate what he calls the competing demands which do not necessarily match the needs of the learners and the teachers. The findings of the study affirm what McNamara sees as teachers acting as agents in meeting the needs of the learners despite the conflicting demands of school administrators and other stakeholders. Thus, there appears to be traces of an emerging paradigm, an alternative paradigm for testing that challenges the monolingual and native speakerism perspectives. To illustrate the English-only policy in one school, in my study, the EOP is purposefully set aside by the teachers in their classroom-based assessment practices because they see the need to accommodate the learners' use of their non-English linguistic resources such as Tagalog to generate ideas for formative assessment tasks. This practice challenges the myth that English and Filipino are in opposition. Another practice found is the tweaking of answer keys, such as giving points to linguistic features of Philippine English in the language tests that are made by the subject coordinators. Allowances are made for the teachers and learners to negotiate valid and meaningful answers to test questions in consideration of varieties of English in the country. Now, this practice presents a challenge to the myth that English is not owned by Filipino users of the language. In the case of English language testing and assessment in the Philippines, in which the American variety remains the target language, the monolingual bias is promoted. Santiago, 2020, whose study includes an investigation of assessment practices of 13 Filipino language teachers in Central Luzon, finds that the teachers are unaware of their monolingual bias in their oral communication classes. In a study of US-funded educational development aid project, Tupas and Tabiola 2017 uncover the monolingual bias is more explicit. The aid project called Job Enabling English Proficiency, or JEEP, aims to improve English language proficiency in Mindanao by supplying state colleges and universities with teaching and testing materials from the United States. Tupas and Tabiola 2017 argue that these materials only expose the native speakerism agenda of the aid project. Indeed, we need policies and practices that are multilingual in perspective, which was mentioned also by Dr. Ealing earlier. To end my presentation, I would like to quote this lines from Yamuna Kachru. The call of Yamuna Kachru to reevaluate the dominant paradigms in SLA research from a multilingual perspective rings true for the current ELT situation in the Philippines. Maraming salamat po. Thank you very much.
Dan again. Thank you so much for your great presentation. So we also have some questions from our dear audience. So shall we start? So the first one, we have a question from Johanna. Do you feel that the teacher in the schools where you conducted your research were aware of the limitation on MCF for summative assessment?
Before I answer that question from Johanna, hi Johanna, I met you before in De La Salle University in the Philippines. It's where I learned about your study, which I use it in my own study. Thank you very much. So regarding your question, do I feel the teachers were aware of the limitations? The quick answer would be yes. However, they're really tied because of these school policies and the rules given by the school administrators. So they are limited on what to do. They are limited on their agency. But what is very surprising is that they still make it to the point. I think that's what teachers are for. They really tend to focus on the needs of the learners. So they really find some ways to compromise that. Sometimes even hiding their practices, their alternative practices, just to meet the needs of the learners, and sometimes to defy those rules, the English language policy, and sometimes questioning even the tests provided by the school administrators. Okay, so thank you. For the second question, I'm wondering what the learners' attitudes to native speakerism biases in the classroom. In the Philippines, sadly, students have preference to English because of the other stakeholders, especially parents. Parents really see that English is like their means for their children to be better, like it's their ticket to a better life. So they subscribe to that English only policy. So even though some students would like to, in a sense, resist the EOP, but because other stakeholders, especially their parents and school administrators, are pushing for this agenda, again, like the teachers, they are limited. And just obey these rules and policies. That's why it's very important that if there would be movement, it should be coming from, it's not only from bottom up, but also from top down. The school administrators, even the parents must uh, be more aware of the effects of, and considering also the context of our country, which is very multilingual and multicultural.
Thank you so much. And we also have the third one from Ramesh. So do you think the idea of forcing the target language on students is helpful or otherwise? In terms with immersive learning, wouldn't it help students as they have to use the target language?
Okay, I think it's really very important to consider linguistic resources. I think it's really supported by SLA research that before you go to the target language, you also need to tap in those linguistic resources, right? Our mother tongues, because and other languages that we know, because the way we think is really more on that basic level, that using our mother tongue. So if it's like double whammy, if you were asking the learners to learn the target language without recognizing our mother languages, it would be more counterproductive, right? Um, and that's what I try to do and also to implement in my own classes. And well, on a personal note, it's very helpful because this is very refreshing for my students, especially coming um, from a context where English only policy was their life during their basic education.
Thank you. And we also have another questions. So have you got any difficulties in doing your research?
Yes, yes, because uh, uh, what do you mean difficulty? Well, there are a lot of you know aspects of doing a research, especially if um, in a sense you are questioning the practices of the school administrators and also of what's happening on the ground, because there's a conflict between what the teacher what the teachers are doing, what are the needs of the students, and what is being mandated or required by the school administrators. It's difficult in that way because I need to be, you know, I need to gain the confidence of the teachers so that they can share more. So I try to visit the schools very often. I talk to them during off class hours so that I could get more sense of what's their feeling, what's their attitudes on these policies and also their practices there.
Thank you. So it seems like really hard work for you, like throughout the research, right?
Yes, I would like to also to read the comment of Johanna Motteram about yes, it's very concerning, the predominance of MCF across the system. Um, is very difficult. That's why I think the talk of Dr. Ling was very important, so that because alternative assessment is really well, it demands a lot of time and effort for teachers, but I think it's worth it if you could start it already, because MCF is very easy to do, right? It's like you could put data bank there and it's easier. But alternative testing and assessment, as what Dr. Ling mentioned earlier, I think it's very important, and I think which us researchers and teachers can also take a look at that.
So far, I mean, like in the, I have also another comments from Joanna. Hold on, let me show you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I read the question?
Sure.
I'm wondering about the impact of the MCF across the education system and then into recruitment selection process. Does this constraint learning? Are learners and teachers more concerned about small snippets? Um, it's very difficult because we have more stakeholders concerned about this, and yeah, I think this is the difficulty of our realities, right? Because it's like a domino effect. So like we cannot have changes in the system if um, if we cannot tap into all of these stakeholders. Because right, if you push for alternative testing of assessment, and then when you go outside the classroom or outside the school, and then government exams are really more on MCFs, it's really difficult, right? So yeah, that's a big concern, really, really. And that's also part of that's also what I would like to pursue for next research, like how would it, how to tap into other stakeholders. Thank you very much, Johanna.
Thank you very much too, Dan. So I think they are all the questions from our audience today. I just would like to give some notes to our audience that we have the survey button on your right screen. So can you please help us to do the survey? And I just did that, and I get 5 stars to our presenter, Dan.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much, Julia.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So in case we don't have any questions, we can end our session a little bit earlier for now. Really thank you. And I hope that you guys, our audience, enjoy our sessions.
Thank you very much. Stay safe.
Thank you.